first shots of the American Revolution were fired in 1775 at the Battle of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. The colonists had an arsenal of weapons stored in Concord, and the redcoats, on their way to seize their weapons, were met by Minutemen who stopped them upon entering Concord. This was the context for Paul Revere's famous Midnight Ride, warning the Minutemen that the redcoats were approaching. Sometimes the first shot of the war is referred to as the shot heard around the war. Heard around the world. Of course, this wasn't literally true, but it had implications for the rest of the world. The first major battle of the war was at Bunker Hill, and here the American colonists surprised the British by their ability to stand their ground. The British suffered more casualties than expected. Although shots had been fired and the war had begun, technically this was not yet a war for independence. It wasn't until the next year that the American colonies would formally declare their independence from Britain by signing the Declaration of Independence. During this time, a pamphlet by Thomas Paine entitled Common Sense was instrumental in convincing colonists that this was the logical step to take. Paine wrote in common everyday language that anyone could relate to. People were reading this pamphlet. It was going through so many editions. They were reading it in the taverns. Those who couldn't read were listening as their friends read from it. And Paine criticized ideas such as hereditary monarchy, insisting that the best thing for the colonies was to be independent. For a while, many colonial representatives, especially from the middle colonies like New York and Pennsylvania, were very reluctant to take the extreme step of declaring independence from Britain. When this step was finally taken and the Declaration of Independence was signed, it's interesting to pay attention to the language that Jefferson used in writing the Declaration. It's addressing King George III directly, pointing the finger at him and listing this long list of grievances. Why is it directed at the king instead of England as a whole? If you think about it, it's a good strategic move, because we're going to be talking about division in a few minutes. And Americans realized that the British people, those in England, were divided over the American Revolution. That some had more resolve than others to fight the war. And by singling out the king, they were avoiding condemning Britain as a whole. Let's consider the advantages and disadvantages of both sides, much as we did with the French and Indian War. When it comes to logistics, the Americans had a clear advantage. They obviously had a home court advantage with the American Revolution fought on American soil. Because of the large numbers of colonists already living there on the ground, they had an advantage in terms of manpower and also supplying the needs of the troops. Food, clothes, and so on. The France factor was crucial. The Americans knew that to have France's support in their war against England would be a huge advantage for them. And for a while, France stayed out of it, watching to see what happened. If you think about it, why would the French get involved in the American Revolution? For one thing, what do we know about France? It's an absolute monarchy. Okay, that is one reason why they might be reluctant to support a war for independence from a constitutional monarchy. They don't relate to the principles of the revolution. However, keep in mind who we're declaring independence from. England, their number one rival. Have you heard the saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Well, this was definitely the case here. France's number one enemy was England, and they knew that by helping the Americans in the Revolution, they would be striking a blow against their number one enemy. Having said that, still, a nation needs to be careful before it gets into a war to calculate whether or not they have a chance of winning. So France held out for a while, waiting to see if the colonists had a chance. Pride and leadership were certainly important factors in the war. On both sides, the Americans and the British had pride, principles that they were standing for. And leaders such as George Washington played an important role in holding the troops together when the going got tough. Let's talk about division. I already mentioned that there was division within Britain. There was also division in the American colonies. Don't assume that the Americans were united to a man in supporting their revolution. In fact, there were three groups: patriots, loyalists, and neutralists, those who were on neither side. It's impossible to know exactly how many colonists fit into these categories. They didn't have polls in place like we do today, no accurate counts to go on. But a key figure of the time who should have been in the know, if anyone was, I'm talking about John Adams, estimated that these groups were roughly evenly divided, that there were about the same number of patriots, neutralists, and loyalists, 1/3 of the population for each group. What do you think caused people to choose sides as they did? It was partly regional. For example, more patriots tended to live in New England. Remember the reputation Massachusetts had for being the center of the American Rebellion. In the South and the back country, there were more loyalists. There were also socioeconomic patterns. Let's think about the stereotypical loyalists. When you think about a loyalist, you may get a picture in your mind of a wealthy person with a thick English accent living in a seaport town, wearing a white powdered wig, white silk stockings, sipping on tea or champagne or something. And that there were loyalists who fit that description. Those who were wealthy and had quite an interest in maintaining good trade relations with England. But there were other loyalists who didn't fit this picture at all. Think about loyalists in the backcountry South, some of the poorest of American colonists. Why might they side with Britain in the American Revolution? Remember some of the East versus West examples of conflict that we discussed in an earlier lecture. Many backcountry inhabitants felt like their number one enemy was their colonial governments, and on more than one occasion they had appealed over the head of their colonial leaders to the King of England and Parliament, complaining of abuses and asking them to intervene. For example, religious minorities who had been persecuted had their ministers whipped in public and imprisoned. Sometimes they had appealed to England, asking for England to step in and intervene. There are patterns, but a common theme is minority status. Okay? Most of the loyalists, whether they were loyalists because of their socioeconomic status or ethnicity or religious persuasion or whatever, often in one way or another were in the minority and felt like they needed England to protect them from the majority within their own colony. Now let's consider British strategy in the American War. The first part of their plan was to concentrate on New England. The idea was if you cut off the head, the body will die. Okay, follow along with this imagery. They saw New England as the head, or you could say the heart, the center of the American Revolution. And just as before the war, they still thought that if they could conquer New England, the revolution would fall apart. It became clear after a number of battles that it would not be so easy to cut off this head. So when Plan A fails, go to Plan B. England then tried to cut down the middle of the colonies. Okay, if they thought that if they were able to establish a foothold in the middle colonies, they would divide the North from the South, and then the revolution would fall apart. The most famous battle from the middle colony part of the strategy was that of Saratoga, New York. When the Americans won at Saratoga, this was all the evidence the French needed to step in. That's probably the single most important thing about the battle, the fact that it resulted in France's intervention. Plan C. England focused on the South. They looked at the southern colonies as the soft underbelly of the revolution. What do they mean by a soft underbelly? Well, weak, vulnerable. You may think of the word ticklish. They thought that this was the weakest part of the American resistance, and that if they could be successful anywhere, surely they could do so in the South. Part of the reason they thought this was they were counting on a large number of loyalists living in the South. And there were some loyalists in the South. But as it turned out, many of the colonists who England thought they could count on being loyalists actually turned out to be neutral. When British troops or American troops marched through parts of the back country, often people changed sides based on who was showing up making trouble in their neighborhoods. Many of them just wanted to be left alone. They preferred not to have to choose sides. And when the British troops marched through, trampling over their fields and eating their livestock, burning down houses, often they ended up pushing these neutralists over to the other side. The most famous battle of the Southern campaign would be the final battle of the Revolution in Yorktown, Virginia in 1781. Here the British General Cornwallis was stationed, and he thought he had a pretty good position to hold, but little did he know George Washington was marching on Yorktown by land, and at the same time a French fleet was on its way by sea. Suddenly Cornwallis realized that he was trapped by land and sea. Not surprisingly, he lost the Battle of Yorktown, and this brought about the end of the American Revolution. As peace talks began, it became evident that different regions had conflicting interests. For example, New England, the South, the back country, had different ideas in mind about securing fishing rights, for example, territory, the right to use the Mississippi River. Different regions had different pet interests, but one thing that united them was the matter of independence. This was non-negotiable to the Americans. England would have to recognize the independence of the American colonies in any treaty. But what about France? France was not as interested in securing this. You might be wondering, well, what business was it of the French in working out this treaty? Well, they were instrumental in helping the colonists win the war. And the American Congress actually instructed its delegates in the peace talks to cooperate with the French, listen to their guidance, borrow from their expertise in working out treaties. When the French were about to sell us out short, as many would say, thankfully, the American delegates decided to go against their orders and stand up for American interests. So in the peace treaty, the Peace of Paris in 1783, the single most important issue was that formally the independence of the American colonies was recognized. Now let's briefly reflect on the causes of the American Revolution. This is a big historical debate. Notice I said causes, because something as big as the American Revolution can't be explained with one simple cause and effect explanation. For example, an economic explanation. Well, there's economic myth and reality. Did money have something to do with the American Revolution? Absolutely. We've been talking about war debt, taxation policies, and so on. You can't understand the American Revolution apart from recognizing the economic issues. But it would be a mistake to try to explain the whole war away simply in terms of money. For example, when you look at how people chose sides in the American Revolution, there's no clear economic pattern. Look at the Loyalists. Some of them were the most wealthy colonists, and yet some of them were the poorest colonists. This clearly wasn't an example of class warfare. Those on the bottom rising up against those at the top. Look at slaves, for example. They were certainly at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder. Slaves tended to be loyalists. Keep in mind, the leading patriots were their masters. It seemed hypocritical to talk about liberty and freedom when they were being held in bondage. Not to mention the fact that the British were promising them freedom if they were to leave their masters and help fight for Britain. What about religious explanations of the Revolution? Here again we have some myth and reality. There had been talk before the Revolution of setting up an Anglican bishop over the colonies. There were some religious fears, but to say that the American Revolution was a war for religious liberty would be a big mistake. Some of the leading patriots were themselves part of established churches in colonies where, even after the American Revolution, they continued to have established churches. You can't properly understand the Revolution apart from ideological explanations. Okay? As I said, money had a lot to do with it, but you can't understand the war simply in economic terms. These taxes we've discussed, they weren't so oppressive that they would explain rising up against England. But if you combine these economic issues with ideology, principle, what kind of ideology? Republicanism, the idea that there should be no taxation without representation. Put these together and you see a recipe for revolution. Finally, let's consider the limits and the legacy or accomplishments of the American Revolution. Here again, historians look at things differently. We're all either optimists or pessimists. Many historians focus on the shortcomings of the Revolution, what it didn't do. For example, after the American Revolution, women weren't given the right to vote. There's a limit to the Revolution. In fact, all white men weren't given the right to vote. There were property requirements for some time. Slavery certainly wasn't ended by the American Revolution. For all the talk about liberty and self-representation, there were some very real limits. It certainly wasn't an example of turning the social world upside down, with those at the bottom now on the top, as we've already seen. There were things that the Revolution didn't do. However, historian Bernard Bailyn used the phrase contagion of liberty to describe how that, in many ways, the Revolution only began when the war ended. some of the long-term changes, such as expanding liberty to other groups of people, would spread gradually. Contagion, like a contagious disease, spreading from one person to another. And not only were these limits often addressed later on, but the simple fact that the American Revolution ushered in an unprecedented great experiment in Republican government that the world had never seen, that in itself is an important legacy.